Well,
Yeah, I agree. So thinking is the key. We started the pre-show here. So I just wanted a couple comments in the pre-show. And this is going back to the Twitter guy a little bit, which I know on the show we're going to kind of use his comments as springboards. I was reading something about, uh, I guess, management or something. There's a lot of business and investing and making decisions in what we're doing. There's a lot of literature
yes.
out there. And so it said that there's two phases that you need to be aware of, and you don't need to necessarily mix them. It's called explore and exploit. So for our listeners, we are in the exploration, exploring phase of our decision analysis. We are not exploiting data yet. We are, we're not making decisions final at this point. We are in heavily in exploring. So that means we're going to be a lot more broader. Our nets are going to be cast wider. And then I hope about probably after the expo, we'll be talking to people there and listening to things. And we'll start really crystallizing our exploitation, Dennis, and we'll be heavily drafting. So I think people mix, what I've seen is people are mixing up the two. And
Yes.
I think the Twitter tries to exploit prematurely and doesn't do enough exploring. And that's why we in science is actually the opposite. I know a lot of people that explore and maybe even have a hard time exploiting. In other words, it's the applied side of science. That's
Yes.
where the politics and a lot of the harm potentially comes in. And you've been debating that for a
Oh
long
God.
time in
Yes.
weather. And
Yes.
what happens is people jump the gun. And, the science, we understand, will never be settled, but exploring allows you to start thinking about how you might exploit, but it's not jumping into the pot yet. You're still walking around the fire. Is the fire warm? Do we need to salt the water before I start cooking the crawfish here? I got to have a little butter, a little garlic. We got to have it just right. So we're
Yep.
exploring the different ingredients, and then we exploit. We do the actual boil and eat. And I think a lot of people want to jump in and start eating in May, and they really need to be starting about mid August here. I understand they're paid to start exploring. That's why, oh, he's best ever, worst ever. This is my sleeper. This is, my bust of the year, because they're trying to exploit things, because that's what gets them clickbait. That's what drives the money, etc. I mean,
Oh
and I
yeah.
I think
Yeah.
people jump the gun. So if you notice, Dennis and I try to start exploring during this time. Dennis will try to jump in with his forecasting, but I assure you that it's not the final
No.
version of his forecast.
No.
People miss, Dennis. I think I think you assume that when people realize that when you forecast, they think, well, it's done, it's settled. They're
No.
missing. It's not settled. You say I'm forecasting because and you have the process you've been doing basically your weather career. But you
Yeah.
probably forget to tell them, folks, this is the background of how, when I say I'm forecasting, this is what it means to me. And maybe it's an article you might want to discuss. I mean, Dennis, it's kind of the forest for the trees. I understand when you make a forecast. I take it in what you're saying and the process, and we know it's not settled. but I think people outside, and the Twitter guy kind of brought that up a little bit, but he was coming from the, whatever you say, it's settled. He missed the point that when we say things, it's not settled, but it's a starting point. So that's some subtlety
Yeah.
there.
Yeah.
Anyway, I'll stop.
And that's really makes a lot of sense, Professor. And I have actually a story from weather forecasting to tell that talks a little bit to this perception of things, of how final a forecast is. So in a weather forecasting operational situation like at United Airlines, we put out 3 forecasts a day for particular cities, particular airports, particular problems. And it was viewed by some of our quote unquote, air quote, customers that if you amended a forecast, it meant that you were admitting that you are wrong. And I had to change that mindset because I said, maybe that's true with lazy weather forecasters, but there would be quite often a time when I amended a forecast before it quote unquote busted. And by that, I mean, I would put out a forecast and I might have a 6-hour window where I expected the worst weather to be occurring. As more information came in, and as you got closer to that forecast situation, maybe that forecast was 12 hours out, whatever. As you got closer to the event, you had a little more certainty, so you might tweak the forecast. And maybe that 6-hour window now becomes a 4-hour window. So, but people, the customers had the feeling, oh, he amended his forecast. It must have gone wrong. No, I'm amending the forecast because I have better information. And I would go on briefings and actually spend some time on a quiet day explaining the rationale about amending a forecast. You're not always amending a forecast because you are wrong. You're amending a forecast because you have better information that can make your forecast more precise. For instance, right now, on May the 17th, my forecast for Kirk Cousins is a low of 10 in MVP and a high of 80 and a high probability that he doesn't play 10 full games because he may not be a starting quarterback. Now, let's say Kirk Cousins gets traded to a team that needs a quarterback. Let's say he lands on the Pittsburgh Steelers tomorrow. Now my forecast can be highly revised. I know that his range of outcomes won't be 70 points in MVP, and it might actually be higher than 80 for the high side. But that's how science works, I guess, when it comes to forecasting. Forecasting anything in the future is an art. It is not a science. It is not an exact science. The science of meteorology, I can tell you what the standard atmospheric pressure is supposed to be. But forecasting what that pressure is going to be for like a drag racing team or even an IndyCar team that is preparing for qualifying at the Indianapolis 500, that pressure value of the atmosphere is key to how they set up their car. My forecast of that will not be an exact science. It will be an educated guess. And in fantasy football, we're dealing with the exact same thing, where we're dealing with educated guesses and range of outcomes. That's the key. Is if I were to put out a forecast, a static forecast for a player, that is not as valuable. If I say Bijan Robinson, his MVP will be 140 this season, that is not as valuable as saying if Bijan Robinson plays 10 games, the low side on his MVP is likely to be 110 or greater. And the high side's likely to be about 155, within 5 of 155. That's a powerful forecast because that lets you know what his worst case and his best case can be for this season. And I know a lot of people, oh, the best case is he scores multiple touchdowns every game. And the worst case is he gets hurt in training camp and never plays it down. That's the range of possible outcomes. It's not the range of logical outcomes. And that's where the difference comes in. Could I be wrong on my low side 110, high side 155? Oh, certainly. But I will wager that for every one of these outlooks that I have for players, I'll have maybe 80% or more that'll land within that range if they play 10 games. That would be a hit. Like, I'd be excited with that. And some years I'll be better, some years I'll be worse. And starting this year, we're actually grading it. So that'll be even more precise. I'm going to grade the May and the August forecast. I only put out 2 forecasts. I will make small revisions between now and then. You know, if something happens, player gets hurt, that will change the forecast of somebody else. Might even be multiple players. Let's say on Atlanta, since I brought up Bijan Robinson, let's say on Atlanta, Drake London goes down with an injury. That's likely to increase Mooney's value this season, but it might also increase Pitts' value at tight end because there's a lot of targets that will be up for grabs. Plus, there'll be a third wide receiver that I haven't even factored into the mix yet for them that might step up. Maybe it's Ray McCloud. Maybe they pick up Keenan Allen. Who knows? But there will be changes that happen every time something occurs in fantasy football. That doesn't mean my forecast was wrong. It means that the forecast on May 17th needed to be adjusted because of new data. And I don't think people realize that, Professor, because you see,
no. I'm wondering if you shouldn't kind of back a little bit with just kind of the process of forecasting.
Yeah,
it doesn't have to be a lot of data, just bullet points, and then you can reference that in all your forecast articles.
Yeah, that's a very good idea because I do believe for a high majority of the people in fantasy football, this might be their very first forecasting situation in life.
Yeah.
Where they've really put a number on something.
Right.
You and I grew up doing that. That's what horse race handicapping is all about.
Yeah.
So you understand.
And our number, we tried to think about probabilities and odds and weighed that. So it's pretty hard, if there's a rainstorm or just something for the horse bucks the jockey off and runs a little bit before he's caught. That okay, what did he just lose the race by wasting his energy? I mean, you have all these thoughts and you're constantly swirling, and about 30 seconds before the race goes off, you're probably starting to make bets. At least that's sometimes I'll wait too late and I get caught, but you're trying to delay that last minute bet kind of concept.
Yeah, and it's the exact same in a weather forecasting situation, because if I've got a 10 o'clock deadline for putting out a weather forecast, and let's say some of the information that I need for that forecast is late, model doesn't run on time, whatever happens, I still have to put that forecast out at 10.
Yes.
But then if more information comes in at 10:30, I don't just sit back with my feet up on the desk. Every layer of new information that comes in has to get factored into that forecast. Now, some of this stuff in fantasy football is completely trivial. If an undrafted free agent out of Hoboken State gets signed by a team, that doesn't mean it's going to affect anything with the main players.
And in your forecast, you need to talk about that because that's actually one of the points I wanted to discuss and uh, about what's trivial and what's not in your forecast. Yeah, I mean you do MVP, and I'll just jump the gun a little bit and say we were talking about defense.
Yes.
Uh, you know, and the argument from the other side in Twitter was, well, if people listen to that, and if they're playing one or two leagues and they listen to that, and they could end up picking X instead of Y, and making a bad choice. And I started thinking about that, and what he missed was the proportion that one should apply to that fact in your forecast. In other words, I wonder, Dennis, I don't think you and I, because I probably jumped ahead, but could we assign all the different factors that we consider and give a percentage, just how we think, not saying this is real, but just kind of how we perceive? Like for you, I would predict your MVP might be higher than me simply because you know what's in it, you've done it, you've lived it, and you've seen, a lot more than I have because I haven't messed with the figure. And I would think Bayer, with his horse racing metric, would probably, realize the opposite side. This is when my numbers are not so good. So in a turf race, I probably shouldn't pay attention, but 50% of my forecast should be with the buyer versus a dirt race sprint, it should be 80 or 90%. You see, he forecasts, oh, I'm going to bet this or this is a good bet, but he doesn't tell you part of the algorithm of what he's thinking about. Or it's in turf. How much is pedigree? Does Bayer even put? Is that 10% of his thinking? Trainer jockey, what is that? You know, and Dennis, I don't think, and I think that down the road, that's what the Twitter guy inspired me. Uh, wow, I got to think, what am I thinking about? And I bet positionally it's different. When I think of tight ends versus running backs, it can't be the same because running backs can
No. Yeah.
rush and they
Yes.
can pass catch.
Correct.
Quarterbacks usually don't pass catch, right? Rarely, but they do rush and they do pass. Versus a tight end doesn't usually pass, doesn't usually rush. You're all about the receiving or the blocking proportion. So I, I I think some of what we need to consider, and I haven't seen this out there. Nobody's Matthew Berry. I would love for him to say, folks, this is exactly when I'm telling you X, Y, or Z. This is my formula. This is my gumbo here. I put 40% crawfish, 10% cayenne pepper, 20% chicken broth, 20% onions and celery and bell pepper. What's your formula for your gumbo? And I bet Matthew Berry would have a different formula for his positions as well. And maybe even team level, and maybe even early ADP, early in the draft, first couple rounds. And I believe you talk about safety versus upside. But what's that proportion? In other words, I guess one day, Dennis, we'll need to start moving to defining those and then testing those proportions, testing our recipes. We haven't even thought about it like that, I don't think, Dennis.
No, and
It's
here's the
there, but
yeah.
I'm not thinking that we've put it to paper, because once you do that, you kind of define it. And I'm wondering, is that right or wrong? In other words, how can we test that? When I put something to paper, a forecast, it makes me want to test things.
Yeah, and here's the thing is I do have that rationale
Mhm.
in my head
But
for
we
how
haven't
to
put it to
come up,
paper,
but I
Dennis.
haven't but I haven't revealed it to even you at this point.
Ooh,
So,
tricky,
yeah.
tricky.
But I do
I'm
have
looking at your blackboard back here. There's a lot of weird figures. I see. I
yeah,
see. Okay.
but I do understand that need
I'm
to
wondering,
really
and it may not be
specifically,
this year, and
yeah,
again, but I'm wondering, would that be more enlightening for people if we said, well, this is our recipe for a tight end forecast? And it might be rookie versus second year versus older running backs, younger. I mean, the recipes could change throughout.
correct.
That's what we're exploring. Actually, you and I are trying to do things like that, but we
Yep.
hadn't put that recipe to paper yet.
No,
Fantasy football recipe.
and I actually have the title of the forecast or the article already said it's the art of the forecast.
Yes,
And
yes.
what I'm going to do is explain the rationale, explain what I look at. Because, for instance, and we've talked about this before, I start at the team level. I don't start at the player level. And I even start at
Your
the
opportunity index. I was
yes,
asking you to define that a little more. What, Dennis? I did that because I was curious about your recipe. I guess I didn't think about it in that term, but I was curious. Well, to be greedy, I wanted you to do that work so I didn't have to do so much because I got other stuff to do, right? I mean, that's why we're a partnership. We're not all working on the same thing. It goes better when everybody's doing their own piece of the pie and we combine it at the end, the ice cream on top of the apple pie.
and what you got me thinking about when because I've always thought in the terms the, these terms don't just happen out of the blue. Okay, let's explain how MVP index came into being. I was always looking at the real high games, the real low games, and the above median games. I was always looking.
The
I've been looking
extremes
at that for.
versus the median.
I've been looking at that for 10 years plus. Okay,
Yes.
but when you and I started working together, and I was explaining that concept, you were suggesting to me there's a formula here. What
Yes.
is the formula? And that's
Yes.
how MVP was born.
Yes.
MVP was born because two scientists got together. Now it's my idea. Okay, it's
Yes.
totally 100% my concept. But you get an assist in the
That's
lab
good. Yeah.
because you got me thinking in the form of put this into a recipe.
Yes.
And so I did. And it literally the first year it was this, and this. And I had definitions for everything. I still do. A full game for a player is for a running back, for instance, is 40% snaps or 10 touches. Because if you get 10 touches as a running back, you better perform. Like if you get 10 touches, I want 10 points. I'm greedy. I
Yes.
want 10 or more points. If you get 10 touches, you should give me a median performance. And we know median is about 12 points, but I rounded it down to 10 just to make it easy. But I also only count 10 touches. Well, the average running back will get closer to, like, the lead running back will get closer to 18 to 22 touches on a particular weekend. But I said, you get half of that. You get 10 touches. I want 10 points. I'm calling that a full game. So if you have a timeshare backfield that is split up, now all of a sudden one of the guys gets hurt, I can expect a little more from the other guy, but I also have to be wary of what is on the bench. Are they just going to split with two different guys? But so that MVP theory and concept was always there. My forecast scheme is pretty easy to understand as well, but I start at the team level. So again, we're talking Bijan Robinson because I've been looking at Atlanta today. And here's the key. I'm always looking at the data. I'm always looking at new ways to look at the data between now and August when I put out my final forecast. But with the Atlanta Falcons, I think their defense is going to get a little better. They added a lot of pieces on the defense. So that's good news for your running back because that's volume. Should be playing from ahead. You got a young quarterback, Michael Penix, only a few games under his belt, is likely to be the starter on week 1. You're going to want to run the ball more and short passes. And Bijan Robinson's good out of the backfield. We know that as well. But Bijan Robinson got way too much volume last year. Does that volume get cut? My guess was that Atlanta would be a better team this year, so they could afford to cut his volume a little bit. So that is the rationale. I expect Bijan Robinson not to get 340 carries like he did last year. I expect it to be a little bit less. And so I'm kind of saying, okay, I think it'll be a little down in volume. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be way down in volume. Okay. It just means maybe he's not going to get as many touches. So that's why I cut his MVP forecast from what he had last year. Last year, 158.8. I also know historically that doesn't happen very often. But I also did some more research to look at number of touches and what it does. What is the next year? What happens the next year after a big touch season? It goes down. MVP goes down. Anything over 309, that's the limit over the last 3 seasons. Now, granted, that's a small sample size, but that's the data that I looked at. Over the last 3 years, the highest number of touches the guy had the year before and went up on his MVP was 309. That shocked me. We've heard the myth of 370 from Greg Kellogg, and he stands behind that number, and he's done the research. He showed the numbers. The reality is it's even less. And here's why this matters. If you draft a guy to have a 120 MVP and he only has a 10% drop from that 120, that's like 108, right? The difference between 108 and 120 is where you drafted him. So if I'm expecting a guy to have 120 as his MVP and he only gets 108, that's not a big deal if I draft him late in the play. If I draft him in the 6th, 7th round, who cares? Like 108 drafted in the 7th round is still a nice find. Anything over 100 is a great find later in the draft. But if I took that guy at his ADP, and the ADP said he should score 120, and now he scores 108. 108 still successful. 108 still contributing to your fantasy football team, but not living up to his ADP. That's why this number is so important. And that's why volume forecasts are so important. But guess what? One of the toughest things to do in football is a volume forecast.
Yeah.
But that's where range of outcomes comes into play. And when I forecast a range of outcomes, I look at the last 3 years. I'll look at a longer. I've got 5 years of data. I'll look at that. But I look at, what have you done for me lately? No different than if I've got a veteran horse running in a race today, and it's going to take a 103 on the buyer to compete at this level. And he hasn't had a 103 since 2018. I don't care about that number. I care, what have you done lately? What have you done in your last 5 starts? If he's been in the 80s, I'm like, that horse is not fast enough to compete. I don't care that he's got a lifetime best of 103. It happened when he was a 3-year-old, and now he's 10 in a claiming race. I don't care. I care what he is doing now. And it's the same thing in football. Now, Bijan Robinson, I only have 2 years to look at. His low is 106.3 as a rookie. His high was 158.8. My range I gave him, 110 to 155. I didn't give him 160. And here's when I do my ranges, I do it by 5-point increments. Understanding I'm going to be a little off. But if I'm within 5 on my high and low forecast, that's a hit because I'm only looking at 5-point increments. Why do I do that? Just to keep the data clean. I don't want to be, and I can't justify a 143 forecast for one guy, a 141 and a 139. That's making it up. All 3 of those guys are in the 140 range. So I already build in some uncertainty because I understand I'm going to not be perfect, which I know is an amazing thing to say to all the blathermouths on fantasy football Twitter, because they have never been wrong in their life until it's pointed out by fantasy receipts, and then they have a tantrum. But I'm going to write this article this week, The Art of the Forecast, and I'm going to show exactly what I look at to forecast. And you know, one thing that is missing from that whole equation?
What?
In May, I don't put defensive matchups. I do not count. I don't look at the games and say, Bijan Robinson's got 6 tough matchups and 3 easy matchups. Therefore, I'm going to lower his MVP. I don't factor it in on a yearly forecast. I factor it in when it comes to looking at a week-by-week performance. And the reason I do that is because defenses are always changing. I will factor it in by August because I'll have a better idea in August than I do in May. How a defense is the defense going to be better or worse? And if I can make that forecast and then look at the defensive matchup data, I might see a guy who's got a big skew to one side of the equation. Just like last year, I saw that Jared Goff was only going to have 3 games all year outside. That was a huge advantage for Jared Goff. That didn't get factored into the May forecast. That got factored into the August forecast. And so I increased his forecast, his upside, and his what I expected out of him because I had more information. Oh, did I have that information in May? Yeah, I did. But it wasn't even part of the equation yet in May. By August, I'm looking at everything. But in May, I'm just looking at the basics. What's a logical range for this player for this season based on what he's done in the past and based on what I know of the team right now. And what I know about the team in August will be a hell of a lot more than I know in May. But that's why certain things get factored in late, some things get factored in early. And to be honest with you, the defensive matchups, they might not matter for a guy like Bijan Robinson, because if you scored a 158.8 last year, that means you did great against really tough defenses and really easy defenses. You were immune to defensive matchups if you're that great of a player. For instance, during the season, I'm not benching my studs because they're playing a tough defense. But a guy whose MVP is 80 or less, and I'm forced to put him in the starting lineup, you betcha I'm looking at defensive matchups because I'm looking at an edge between two average players. And a big average, a big change for an average player is if he's playing a weak team. That's just common sense. But the great players, they're a little less affected by a great defense. Otherwise, they wouldn't have scored over a 150 on an MVP. That 200 is the max, Professor, that somebody could have for the whole season. Nobody's done that yet. Guys been in the 160s. McCaffrey had a season over 160, but that's very unusual because it's a long season.
Couple things. The defense, the schedule, the data people are discussing, or the whole season, very inaccurate. You and I get the advantage after about 3 or 4 weeks of looking at this year. In other words, we quit looking at last year
Yes.
and this year. And every week, you and I are looking at Vegas information. We're looking at home away that the team has showed their efficiency level, that I have an
Yes.
equation for that. So when we do the breakdown, we look at the DAPS, and that's not what is been released. That's just kind of what's coming down the pike. But the amount of information, or the amount in the recipe, to me would be maybe one of a few factors for tie breaking. In other words, if I literally have two players and they both
Yes.
have the same opportunity, the same value,
Yes.
maybe I'll, look at what they did last. I mean, it's not really that critical to me. But I'm not sure people that don't understand the art of the forecast, and Dennis, you're going to talk, will realize that. They'll just, oh, well, they are predicted to have an easy schedule in the fantasy playoffs. Folks, that Dennis and I give that very, like I said, the amount, how two players must be so close together that we're getting down to that hierarchy to break the tie.
Yep.
I can't even think of when that's happened. I notice it, but then what did they do for targets? Boy, they sure had a lot of attempts last year. Got a new coach. I mean, the recipe gets muddled, Dennis. And I think maybe people, and the Twitter guy was right, that people, if they use that for 100% of their recipe, probably are going to
Yes.
make a lot of bad
Oh,
decisions.
horrible
But
decisions.
to say that to me or to you implied that we don't realize the subtlety, that we're just, we're slaves to the day. Folks, we are not, because it's floor and ceiling, and its probabilities and averages and distributions, and thinking like that. You're never hard in concrete stuck on anything. the range of outcomes may be pretty close, and that's probably good. I mean, at least, I mean, you could be wrong, but at least that's what you're thinking. Versus, and I showed Dennis, there are already players that, we can talk about on the show a little bit that the public's already going to have. I predict, based on what I'm seeing now, there's probably going to be debates throughout the summer on some of these players that have already kind of, the public's already showed their cards a little bit, that they're having trouble, getting that window, that floor ceiling to be very, very close. They're showing that they're seeing it not so close, and that causes a lot of debates, and I think we're going to see that. So I'm going to bring that up on the show a little bit.
Yeah, and one of the problems you can get into is if you do factor defensive matchups, even for the fantasy football playoffs, in too much.
Oh yeah,
it can take you out, because here's a case in point. Okay, I got team A. I'm going to use a generic. I got team A that's got a great running back, great wide receiver, but because of their MVP, or their ADPs, I'll probably get them both on my team. And I can probably take their quarterback later in the draft and maybe their tight end. Let's say I've got this ultimate great situation where I can stack the entire team, and they got 3 lollipops on their schedule for the fantasy football playoffs. I mean, it's the perfect scenario, right? So I load up and I've got one of each, and I've got the starters at each position on my team. Week 4, the quarterback goes down for an injury. What does that do to my ultimate stack for the fantasy football playoffs? Probably turns it into garbage. So I never try to get too large of a stack from any team based on the fact that one injury can doom you. It could be even something even crazier. What if all of your skill position players stay healthy, but all of a sudden you get 3 injuries on the offensive line, and the offensive line turns into a sieve, and all of a sudden that great offense turns into a mediocre offense, and you're stuck with one of each for the fantasy football playoffs. It's the case of diversifying your risk in fantasy football. I don't want too many guys from the same team. Now, I want both running backs from a backfield. I've talked about that time and time again. I draft James Conner from Arizona this year. As soon as he goes off the board, I'm targeting Trey Benson. And right now I can get Conner at pick 58 on FPC. I get Benson 71 picks later. It's not like I have to struggle to make that matchup work. It's not that I don't have faith in James Conner holding the job all season. It's just that if I like James Conner, that means I like the Arizona Cardinals running back situation. If Conner goes down, Benson plugs right in there. Unlike some teams, Carolina, for instance, I got Chuba Hubbard, I got Rico Dowdle, I've got Trevor Etienne, the rookie. Notice Trevor, not Travis, his brother. So I've got 3 guys. Who's going to win that spot? I don't know. I might take a shot at 2 out of 3, but I'm not going to worry about trying to own that backfield because it's too uncertain. Bijan Robinson and Tyler Algier. Tyler Algier is going to be a big drop off from Bijan Robinson. Do I want that protection? Maybe. it's a lot different than Connor and Benson. James Conner could lose his job as the starter. He's age 30, could be slowing down. Bijan Robinson's not losing that job unless it's injury. I used the same theory last year, Professor. I had a lot of Rashid White, and every team I grabbed him, I grabbed Bucky Irving. Loved that rookie. How did it work out? I had lots of weeks I played them both, and I was happy. But when Irving took over, I had the starter. Now, if Irving got hurt, I got the starter. Like, I could not lose on that one. And they were priced right. Both of them were a bargain. So I got the whole backfield on an offense that I knew was going to be really good. Here's the thing we know about defenses. Okay. Defenses do change. But if you go from extreme worst, okay, bottom six, we like to break it up in sixes, right?
Yeah.
Bottom six to top six, every single time that has happened over the past 5 years, I can look and tell you exactly why it happened. And I can even tell you that if a defense had a lot of injuries last year, Dallas, for instance, if they're in that bottom six, I'm not believing that they're staying in the bottom six this year because they've had coaching change and they've had guys coming back from injury and they've added people. So if a team is in the bottom six or the top six, I don't just automatically say, they're there for this year. I'm pretty convinced they're probably not going to go from one extreme to the other unless there's a really good reason. And that really good reason has been forecastable. The Eagles made a huge jump last year, but that's because they were hurt in 2023. They added good players in 2024. They changed defensive coordinators. They had the best of everything going on. Did I expect them to become a top 5 or 6 defense against fantasy points at each position in 1 year? No, but I knew they weren't going to be bottom anymore. That's how you can use this information and your knowledge of the game of football and injuries to factor in. And you could do the same thing on offense too. So it's not impossible to figure out who's going to get better and who's going to get worse. But my starting point for the bottom 6 defenses, they got to prove to me that they're not going to be in the bottom 6 this year. So will I factor it into my drafting? Yeah, if I got 2 guys that I can't separate any way else. But usually it got something to separate them on. If I got 2 wide receivers rated the same, teams haven't changed, there's no, big change that would indicate why one guy over the other. And I got one guy who's an improving 23, 24, 25-year-old, and I got the other guy who's 32 years old. Which one am I taking, Professor?
Depends on your range of outcomes and your opportunity index.
But let's say the range of outcomes are exactly the same and the teams haven't added a replacement at the position. I'm going for youth because I know that the young players get better. And I'm not sure where the top end is for older players. I mean, we know when there usually is a decline in numbers.
Yeah. But there's some strange outliers.
Oh, yeah.
That if you look across, I've looked at the age stuff, not this year, but there's some outliers that have potentially streamable situations.
Oh, the survivors are definitely there.
Yeah.
But
my feeling is people miss them or devalue them.
Oh, and in fantasy football startups, like dynasty startups that are having their first year draft,
Yeah.
28 and 29-year-old wide receivers get treated like lepers.
Well,
Like,
Dennis, if I was in those, I'd start that discussion early. Boy, that sure is an older player to be.
boy,
I'd get them thinking that way early,
yeah.
and then draft, as you need to. And if they say anything like, "Yeah, I'm taking a chance," and then all of a sudden, time they wake up at the end of the season, you're in the playoffs. And how'd you get there with them old players? Well, you know, I've seen you pull that, Dennis.
Oh,
One of your
I
tricks.
try to pull it as often as I can.
But I'm
Well,
saying start
Professor,
churning the water, chumming them up. Make, like I said, serve them the whiskey and start talking about them old decrepit players. Maybe even come in with a walker saying, "I know some of you go get these old players. I'm just going to stay away from them." And then, really try to get them going. And then you
yeah,
draft as you need to.
I try to point out that as an old guy, I understand father time
Uh,
catches up to all of us.
yeah, yeah.
And then I take all the 28 to 30-year olds.
Anyway, we probably need to start the show, Dennis. It's
Here we go.
getting ridiculous here.
Ridiculous is one thing that we do quite well.
Well,
All right, let's get the show on the road. Here we go. How you doing, everybody? This is Dennis Michelson. Welcome to the science of fantasy football. Why the science of fantasy football? Well, you get a meteorologist and a biologist together. They're going to use the scientific method. What does that mean to you, the fantasy football player who might have gotten a D in high school chemistry? It just means we're going to use data in a smarter way. We're going to put the data to the test. And when the test is done, we'll have more information and better information and make better decisions in fantasy football. That's why I can say if you put the scientific method to work for you, you will be a smarter fantasy football player this year. And joining me as he does each and every week, he is the fantasy professor. He's a real professor emeritus. It's John Bush. And John, the emeritus just means you survived a lot of students.
yeah. But it's good now. A lot of them have graduated medical school, actually. So I know a lot of doctors and vets and pharmacists. It's really interesting. As a biologist, you get to do that. And
It,
I've trained some graduate students as well to get their PhDs and whatnot. So it's
men,
it's it's satisfying. It is, Dennis. So, I've lost all my hair because of them. But that's part of it. It's kind of like having your kids in science. That's what I called them. And
yeah.
they were brats about halfway through, and then at the end they realized, hopefully realized what you'd done for them.
Yeah, and it's funny because I've done a lot of mentoring for
Yes.
a variety of people in different industries. I've got a weather forecaster who I trained fresh out of college, who is quite the TV weather guy out in Baltimore, Maryland, and reasonably famous in the industry. And he credits me for making him think harder about the actual weather forecasting part of the job. I've got a young lady who I worked with at the radio station that is on a network, ag radio network now, doing great things and is considered one of the rising stars in the industry. Every week when I turn on auto racing, I see one or two or three young men or women that I helped coach in how to speak better when I was doing media coaching training of young athletes. When you see somebody that you worked with that's having success, it's great. And that's part of the reward of being around for a long time, doing a bunch of different things, is when you get to see your students succeeding, it's such a thrill. And I get that same feeling in fantasy football when we can actually teach somebody to think a little bit smarter in the way that they're looking at stuff. But Professor, I don't so much have a gripe. We talked a little bit on the pre-show today about the run-ins over on fantasy football Twitter with people that, it always amazes me how perfect everybody is on fantasy football Twitter. Yet there's a site called Fantasy Receipts that gets to rake them over the coals for all the times that they're wrong. But when we were talking about that, it dawned on me. I talked about a 75% advantage, and this person that we were discussing stuff with was like 75%. That doesn't matter. If you're basing your decisions on a 75% occurrence, you're not going to do well. And I'm like, what? In weather forecasting, Professor, there were times when I had to make a decision that wasn't based on the statistics going to be better than a 75-25. But I knew that the range of outcomes were going to be in the favor of the operation. I made decisions all the time on 75% probabilities and saved millions for my clients. So I think someone who wants more than 75% certainty in fantasy football is probably fooling themselves. Is there a 75% certainty that any player isn't going to have an injury this year?
Unless you can predict that, I don't think so.
And we keep diaries on what our teams do and our strategies. How did that work? I'm not sure that I can look at it. And here's the thing, Professor, you and I are very profitable in fantasy football.
Yep.
Do you win 75% of the leagues you play in?
No.
I don't yet.
I wish.
Now I'll get to the playoffs more than 80% of the time. That to me is very good.
Yeah.
I'll get to the Final Four about 40% of my leagues. I think that's really good. But if I could get to the Final Four 75% of the time, boy, we would be talking even better vacation money.
Yeah.
But 75%, folks, that's a huge advantage in any forecast situation. And here is an application of that. I'm saying you don't even have to be 75% success rate to have great success in something that adds so much value to your fantasy football team. Forecasting bargain running backs, for instance. Last year, Chase Brown, all over him. Bucky Irving, all over him. As I said in the pre-show, I had lots of Rachaad White as well. So I wasn't saying that Rachaad White was going to be a bust. I just knew Bucky Irving was going to be the first or second best running back on that team. So, but I was wrong on some rookies as well. I thought Audric Estime from Denver could get the starting lineup. Never happened. But the key is, if I'm right, 1 out of 4 rookie running backs who are huge values. Now, that doesn't count Ashton Gianti this year because he's going in the first round. But if I'm right about 1 out of 4 guys taken after pick 100, I'm going to be pleased. And when I say I'm right, if they become RB1s, QB1, WR1, or tight end top 6, and I'm getting them after pick 100 in a fantasy football redraft, I'm going to do a little dance because I'm going to be pretty doggone happy if I hit
Will
one
you
out of four.
video that dance, please?
I will do a video.
Okay.
But the thing is, quite often I'll hit maybe two or three of those guys in late drafts. Now I'm really cleaning up. But the key is you don't have to be right 75% of the time at keep. I hope I'm right more than 75% of the time when it comes to the guys I draft in the first round. I hope I'm right like 90% or better. But at certain parts of the draft and certain parts of the fantasy football situation, 75% is a huge advantage.
Uh, Dennis, I think I'm gonna share something. You don't know this is coming.
Woohoo.
This is our dynasty, folks. We just had our rookie draft, and look at the running backs this man took. This man, if think about it, Dennis, if you knew exactly who to take, you'd pick some other types, but you did the old chaos draft here. Really love it. Our main guys are Bucky Irwin that you got last year. Good
Yep.
job. We won second, and Chuba. But boy, Dennis,
And we
and we
got Chuba.
probably should do a article just kind of showcasing how you did this. I mean, you you picked well. I thought we covered some bases here, and I noticed you got a nice rookie down here in Tampa Bay,
Oh, yeah.
and
Yep.
another one in Washington. I mean, it wasn't like it's all he took, but it's clear that you had a strategy this year and you were trying to figure it out. Now, what's going to get Dennis going? And I don't know where it is, but I would probably think that one of these that you're going to have to drop is going to
Oh,
pay off, and you're
yeah,
going to
they
be
are.
angry, and
Yeah.
you're not going to know now because I think we have to do
No.
this in August. What we
Correct.
have to so I'm just Dennis is going to tear the rest of his hair out, one or two strands left, like me, that to try to stop that. And so, but I predict, Dennis, you're going to make something. You're going to have some hits, but I bet you're going to have some misses. And I, I,
Yes.
I wish we could get better than that, but that's just life. I mean, you can't go into dynasty thinking everything's 100% because I think you'd be so depressed you wouldn't even want to. This game is luck. I'm out of here, folks. It's not luck. Dennis didn't draft for luck. He drafted for upside. He drafted that we needed running backs because our team is pretty good in quarterback. He made that decision. Tight end, you made that decision. Wide receivers, you made that decision. So it wasn't by chance that we end up with this suite of, long shot running backs. There's two or three good ones in here somewhere. Maybe a couple weeks, enough to get us through. But, just spending the time to figure out who those are, right? Training camps are coming. Could be some injuries. Who knows what's going to vault some of these up a little bit. But I
Eh,
really enjoyed watching your draft, and I was kind of a little bit. I didn't jump in too much. I didn't want to mess with the maestro as far as the dynasty. So I was watching you. I think this is very intriguing. And you didn't know I was going to even bring this up. But anyway, you got us to third 2 years ago. You got us to second last year. So I want us to continue to be in the top three, Dennis. That's my hope. And I will be happy, that we don't fall back down. I want us to collect some cash and keep it rolling.
in FPPC Dynasty is a lot different, folks. You
Oh,
only
it's
have
hard
20
too.
roster
Yeah.
spots,
Yeah.
and in two of those, are reserved for a kicker and a team defense. So you only have 18 players on your total dynasty roster, and there's no taxi squad. You do have IR spots, so you can park a guy in IR if he's on injured reserve or pup, but not if he's out for the week. Mm-hmm. So it makes you manage your team a little different. We also had Tyrone Tracy and Isaac Guerrero last year.
Yes.
Kept Estime over those guys. Obviously, we kept Irving because he was already starting pretty early in the season. But when Cooper Kupp went out and Jalen Waddle was doing horribly, we needed to patch and fill. And then, of course, Hawkinson was out, so we had to patch and fill at tight end as well. Granted, we were able to get Ertz off of waivers, which was a gift.
Yes.
But do I wish I had not? Do I wish I'd kept Tyrone Tracy? Yes. And I wish I had kept Guerrero. Yes. But the reason they were expendable in this forecast this format is because one, Tracy was with the Giants, okay, and they were horrible. Now I know I grabbed Skatebow here this year, but that was a value play in the second round because we need a running back, and I'm not convinced Tracy's the guy. That was the other reason I was willing to get rid of him because I didn't trust he was the guy long term.
When you say that, you mean bell cow? You mean define the guy?
He wasn't going to be the guy who's going to get 15 plus touches for more than
a volume guy
for future seasons.
You think his range of outcomes is pretty high, pretty large.
Yes. Yeah. He's got a very low, he could be, this is why I grabbed Skatebow. I think Skatebow's got the potential to beat out Tracy. Now, I wish I'd still had Tracy. Okay. Well, that was a mistake I made.
Yeah.
I'd have both of them on the team and I'd feel really good about that. But what these guys have in common, Skatebow, Blue, both have a path to the starting spot year one. Brashard Smith with Kansas City does something a little bit different than Pacheco. So he might get more use down the line as a receiving back and might be able to pull that whole job if Pacheco gets hurt. But you notice I picked up two veterans as well as rookies at running back. Elijah Mitchell. Now we're covered with 2/3 of the solution if Pacheco isn't ready to go or has another injury. And then Nick Chubb is the ultimate wild card. Where is he going to land? Now, if Nick Chubb doesn't have a job by the time we have to make roster cuts, he's gone.
He gone.
Alexander Madison is the first on the chopping block right now. So those are two cuts that'll probably be made. It's very possible Elijah Mitchell ends up on PUP this year and doesn't end up, as an active player. So maybe we can put him on injured reserve and have him back later in the season. But that's the way I'm going to manage this team is I'm going to look and also going to look at trade possibilities. Let's say that CJ Stroud is lighting it up in preseason and Richardson isn't a botch job. He's playing okay. All of a sudden, look up here at Detroit at Goff. So look at our bye weeks, 6, 8, and 11. We have no conflict with a bye week. If we had 2 of our 3 quarterbacks on the same bye week, then we need that third guy. In this case, we don't. I'm not getting rid of Goff, but I might trade either Stroud or Richardson if the right value comes along. But the right value is going to have to be a first-round draft pick, or I'm not going to get rid of them. And I'm not getting a first-round draft pick for Richardson right now in 1 QB leagues, and I'm probably not getting it for Stroud. So we'll hold. But somebody might need need a quarterback. Somebody might agree, and they're only carrying two. Now all of a sudden, I offer him Stroud for maybe a running back and a second round pick or a first round pick, straight up. And now I've got one more roster spot to have to use this year. Now, next year, Richardson could be out of a job, and then I've got to fill in that quarterback. I'll figure it out. We'll find another quarterback for the bye weeks. I like Goff long term. I think the next 3 years, he's a solid guy. Is he going to be as great as he was last year? Probably not. But he's a solid starting quarterback, and he ain't going anywhere. And that's why I like Stroud as well. Stroud's under contract. He's not going anywhere. Richardson's even under contract. He ain't going anywhere. But, one of those two has to make a big improvement this year. And if they both make a big improvement, one of them will be off the roster because somebody will want to make a deal. So Cam Skatebow was a trade we made. We got rid of Aaron Rodgers 2 years ago for a future second round pick that ended up being Skatebow. That's not a bad deal. I'm pretty happy with that in a one quarterback league.
Yep. I thought it was good. I just wanted to bring that up to people to kind of see how you approached this kind of situation. It wasn't random. You have a recipe. We discussed the art of forecasting. I'm pushing Dennis to define his recipe. He likes that. That makes him happy. And he will be ecstatic after we finish this podcast because that's part of my job. I didn't realize that was going to be part of my job, but that's what works with our partnership is that nudging and asking Dennis questions and in other words, I know he knows it, but I'd like to see it on a piece of paper so I can look at it and others can look at it as well. And I think people will at least start thinking about the art of forecasting, Dennis, in their diary. They should start noting what is their recipe for each choice. Maybe that's an improvement. Maybe if I get around to doing the diary, maybe that's how we define decisions in our diary is what was your recipe? I want you to tell me, not to the, 99.1%, but what was the general driving factor for your trade or your draft or how you played this team? In other words, start defining because next year you're going to forget if you play, more than 3 or 4 leagues. I mean, I play 40, so I'm going to forget. So having a recipe, a diary recipe is, I think, that next step in making your diary better, Dennis, is defining a recipe for your decisions.
Yeah, I do believe that. And you actually inspired a couple of mini studies in the past week since the last time we chatted here on last week's podcast, because we talked about the opportunity index.
Yeah,
and I've been working to define that number.
Yeah, and the recipe.
And I realized that my hypothesis had never been tested.
No.
So I did. I went back and I tested. So what I looked at was the last, again, from 2020 to 24. I looked at the guys that were replaced. Okay. The guys that had starting running backs. I'm trying to draw
here on our whiteboard, Dennis.
So starting running backs the previous year.
Yeah.
Who lost their job the next season.
Yeah.
Now, this didn't mean that the person got traded. Okay. I didn't count
that. So Dennis
is
giving our recipe right here.
Yep.
Your study.
for running backs.
Yeah.
So I looked at running backs and I said, okay, the guys that got replaced, and I'm talking they were still under contract.
Okay.
They lost their job. What did they have in common? And so I looked at those who kept their job.
Yeah.
What was their MVP score?
So you were using MVP.
Using MVP as a level, because as I'm building my opportunity index, I want to compare it to something I already know is successful.
Mm-hmm. So
because
under
I
contract,
know,
but lost the job, right?
Yep, lost the job. So they were still on the roster, lost the job for whatever reason. Now, some of them could have been hurt. Okay. There might have been injuries, minor injuries, opened up the door, didn't care.
Right.
All I looked at was they were still on the roster, they were replaced.
Right.
What was their MVP the year before?
Year before.
So here's what happens that's very interesting. Anybody, so there were 65 guys that got replaced over that time frame.
What year was it? I mean, how many years?
There was a 3-year period.
3 years. Wow, that's a lot of turnover.
20 to 21, 21 to 22, 22 to 23.
So the first question
years.
I have, Dennis, when you do wide receivers, would you be doing 65? That's a lot of turnover. Didn't know it was that high.
This is running backs. This is 4 seasons. It was 4 seasons.
Okay.
Not 4 years.
4.
I can't count. But 4 years.
4 years.
And 65 guys got replaced.
Wow. That's a lot.
That's a lot. Okay. So that's a lot of guys losing their position. But you showed the research last week of how much turnover there is in fantasy points per game finishes from one season to the next. And
about 50%.
It was pretty amazing. So 65 guys lost their jobs.
Yeah.
So here's the deal.
Okay.
Of those 65, not a single one who scored over 100 on MVP the year before lost their job.
So that was kind of a line in the sand then.
That is a definite line in the sand. So
that is amazing.
Remember, I had talked 120 was my guess. I said hypothesis is 120 because 120 is an elite level running back and people want to replace elite level.
Yeah,
100 is a top 12 level.
Right.
It appears that my top 12 are safe.
That's interesting.
So that gives me a number to compare to.
So you would say that everybody this year that has 100 or better, there's a good chance they will still have a job and will be very involved.
Yes.
So for dynasty, right? I'm even thinking next year for trades, Dennis. In other words, could you spot mid-season? They've kept 100 most weeks. You see what I'm saying? Could there be some trade that maybe people are thinking, maybe they're to get a little older. I don't know. Is there any advantage in dynasty to this study?
Yeah, I definitely think there is. And here's the thing is one of the best things that happens daily on fantasy football Twitter is when I get challenged on whether I'm right or wrong about a player.
Right.
And the reason I love that is because that helps you get better. Sean Mitchell, real smart guy, worth following on Twitter. Him and I go toe to toe almost every day.
Good.
Quite often we agree. Quite often we disagree. We're on different sides of a player. So he pointed out some stats with Rico Dowdle. Not a guy that I like. 62.5 last year with his MVP.
Sounds like he won't keep his job.
So vulnerable to and he ended up going free agent from Dallas to Carolina. So that Dallas job will, if it's somebody else, that doesn't get counted as getting replaced because he was off contract. But does he beat out Chuba Hubbard for the starting role?
What was Chuba's MVP?
Chuba's was 100 last year.
Nice.
So unless Chuba
gets
comes
injured
into camp gimpy, I kind of like his chances of holding that position. But Sean pointed out that early in the season last year, the first 8-9 games of the season, Dallas was splitting the touches between Ezekiel Elliott and Rico Dowdle.
Yes.
And Rico Dowdle finally got all the volume because Elliott was father time caught up with Ezekiel Elliott. So they started using him less and less and Dowdle more and more. But when I did the figures on the last 8 games of the season, or last 10 games of the season, his MVP was only an 80.
Still wasn't that 100 level.
Still wasn't at 100. His best 10-game MVP, if I throw out the bad games, only look at the top 10, 110. That's pretty good. Chuba Hubbard, his best 10, 160.
Nice.
So he's got him beat for the whole season.
And the best 10.
And the best 10. That tells me I like his chances. But the fact that Rico Dowdle could get that much volume and stand up to it, maybe I take a late shot at Dowdle. And especially if I grab Chuba Hubbard at pick 51, which I think is maybe a little early for Chuba this year. 161, I can get Dowdle. That's basically free.
Yes.
And Trevor Etienne, the rookie, Travis Etienne's brother, is on that roster, and he's basically free right now. He's not even showing up in the top 200 in ADP right now on FPPC. So that's a muddled spot because there's 3. But this research tells me Dowdle's got a decent shot at holding that position. Does that mean he's going to finish 100 or higher in MVP? No. He could have a drop off in MVP. All I'm saying is he'll be the number 1 back. More likely than not is what this study says, because over 4 years, it hasn't happened yet. Small sample size. Only 4 years. Do we know that that's 4 representative years? Or was it 4 years where this happened and the next 4 years something completely different will happen? We don't know.
Right.
But I know in recent past performances, Chuba Hubbard's got a good buyer's number, I guess is the way I'd say it. So going into today's race at the same class, he's a good bet. So there was another study that you inspired because we were talking about volume, right? So the number 370 has been out there as the magic volume number. I've got news for everybody. It might be a lot lower than 370. And I'll tell you why. What I looked at was everybody who had more than 250 touches. And I looked at from 2020 to 2023, looked at over 250. And the following year, what did their MVP score do? Did it go up, down, stay about the same? Or did they have an incomplete season where they didn't even finish the season? Here's the scary numbers. So out of everybody who had over 310 or more, there were 17 of those guys over that 4-year period.
Yep.
You know how many declined?
I don't know.
Every single one. That's pretty scary.
So how many, what was the number again? 300?
So there were 310 touches. So that's a combination of carries and receptions.
So 310, 17, nobody stayed the same. They went down.
All went down. Some only went down 6 points. That was the lowest drop.
Mm-hmm.
The highest drop was 68 points on MVP.
Wow. So that's a lot of variation.
A lot of variation. And there were...
That's going to tend to hide some of these effects too.
And there were 3 guys that didn't have 10 or more games played.
Okay.
3 out of the 17, Professor, didn't play a full season the next year.
Mm-hmm.
That's a scary number.
So the ones that improved during this time, what were their touches? What was their median touch?
Great question. So again, I'm looking at only guys over 250 touches. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 more players.
Right.
One stayed even.
Okay.
At 306 touches. One stayed even.
Right.
And the best increased by 65 points on MVP. And he had 308 touches. Okay, so you could say, what's the difference between 308 and 310 statistically? Absolutely nothing.
Yeah.
What this tells me is there will be outliers in this study. There just weren't in this last 4 years.
Yep.
Doesn't mean there won't be going forward. But the number of touches of guys that increased, so one stayed the same exactly, 100% the same down to the digit, which shocked me.
Mm-hmm.
Of the others, they varied from an increase of just 6 to 65. So again, a huge variance. We can't use this data and say he had 285 touches last year, so therefore he's going to have an increase of 20 on MVP. You can't do that because the variance will be plus or minus on his MVP. You can't use this to forecast an absolute MVP number. But what it tells me is at 310, that's a bad number because we're 17 of 17.
So who is that we're talking about this year?
So this year, we've got a pretty big population to look at because we've got the king of touches, Saquon Barkley, who was at 378. We got Bijan Robinson, who you know I'm crazy about being
crazy.
Great. But I did say in my forecast, I expect his MVP to drop. Now, that doesn't mean he's going to be a bust because he was 158. So if he just drops to 140, he hits this study, but he's still elite. He's still top 3. Kyron Williams had 350, Derrick Henry at 344, Josh Jacobs at 337, and Jonathan Taylor at 321. Those are the guys over 310 this year. So there's 6 of them that will be added to this study. So did you notice something right there? There was only 17 in the last 4 years. There were 6 last year.
So it's a lot per year. Yeah, a lot more last year.
So we had guys, we had a lot more last year than we had for the previous 4. Does that mean that coaches have changed their strategy. No, it just means we had fewer injuries at the top end. Yeah, running back.
Yeah.
Because if you look at the total number of guys over 300 touches last year, there were 9 of those. That was a high. That was high over the last 5 years. That was on the high side of the range. So we had extremely good health at the running back position. Mm-hmm. But this study made me think and said, you know what? Mm-hmm. It doesn't mean I'm not going to draft Saquon Barkley because he had 378 touches. But what it tells me is expect a decline. Because if anything else, he'll probably have a decline in volume because they're not going to want to throw another 378 on top of last year's 300s. That's a lot of wear and tear on a running back. I don't think you want to do that. Mm-hmm. What that tells me is maybe I get a spot start by A.J. Dillon this year. They signed him as a free agent for a reason.
The only thing I would do if I was looking at your touch is I would try to factor in the proportion of receiving versus rushing.
Good idea.
In other words, Bijan is 304 and 60 receiving receptions.
Yes. Yeah.
Versus Jonathan Taylor, 303 versus 18.
Yes. Yes.
So the proportion is different between those two. So yes. Is that more wear and tear or less, or it doesn't matter, right? There's 3 possibilities. And I can think of the study. If I had time and I wasn't trying to do what I said, our secret stuff that we're trying to do, that would be what I would do, Dennis. And I would do something called rush receiving ratio.
I like that.
And I would look at total touches and then look at in those above 310 or 310, look at the proportion and see if you can't catch some of the outliers. Maybe they were low reception or high reception or me. I would just like to see the difference there. I mean, that data is easily available. I'm sitting there looking at it now. We should be able to grab that.
Oh yeah. We can easily do that. What I was
the
looking
highest
at
for the running backs last year was 78 receptions. You know who that was?
It had to be Kamara.
Number 2. A-Chain. Number 1.
Kamara was number 2.
Number 2. Oof. It was 228 and 68. A-Chain 203, 78.
Wow. Very interesting.
And in Bijan, number 3. So does that give you a little more life? In other words, long term, it would be nice to look at that ratio over their lifespan for running backs. Remember, I always argued that a lot of those older running backs seem to catch a lot more balls than the younger ones, than the older ones that fell out.
Correct.
I think there's some data there that if I had time, I would do it, but I don't have. If I was paid by ESPN that more money, I'd get, you'd get me some interns and I'd set them loose on some of this stuff and we would do the stats and we would take care of business. But right now, there ain't no money for the professor. So I'm going to have to do other things, secret stuff that Dennis and I need to make our ROI go up this year. That's what I'm doing.
Yeah, and here was the point of the study, was just to see if there was any correlation at all.
Yeah.
Now that I see there's a correlation,
I would investigate some things.
That may or may not be true. Now it will be digging in.
And Dennis, if I had 10 or 15 years of data, it's something else I would look at any imbalance early and late season. In other words,
Yes.
were they heavily used early and then late they slacked off? Did that versus the opposite, where they came on late? They were used
Yes.
heavily late. I would
Yes.
just want to look at the skew one way, skew the other, and then kind of the median. So that would be my three groups. And, the Twitter guy, when I proposed, and Dennis, no offense, but this is and you saw this when I went to the expo, is when I ask a question and they give me some information and I know it's really not to my effort to continue really heavily discussion. And so I think I asked him some yeah, you're laughing. And I think he said something. I said, nice hypothesis. If you decide to test it, please let me know the results. We always need to encourage fantasy football science analysis. Maybe 10 years of data with dividing into three groups by position, top, bottom, mid, followed by ANOVA, and maybe Tukey testing of the groups. And Dennis, I was waiting for him to pick it up to say, yes, I will do that. I would love to do that, but I don't know how, i.e., be glad to mentor you. He didn't take
Yes.
that versus
No.
let me just forget about that and go over here and start squawking about something else. In other words, I realize I stepped in it. I'm not going to actually put that effort in of, working. In other words, I'm not going to learn to chop the damn wood. That's fine. I mean, I have students all, they'll sit there and they'll say, Dr. Bush, I need some study notes. So Dennis, basically they're trying. And so Dennis, I actually did a video where I actually discuss all the study notes they need for a concept. Oh, Dennis, I said, you need to do, a concept map. Then you need to write and define all the terms in your concept map. Then you need to write some questions and the answers that could be from that data. And then, Dennis, this is a good one. Let me look at those questions and all your homework and I'll see what you missed. Dennis, I actually had one guy early on says, oh, I do stuff like that. I said, great. Why don't you come tomorrow and let me look at your notes? I said, that should be 200 or 300 pages of notes for the last test. I'll help grade that. Dennis, I still waiting for him to give me that stuff. He gone. I think he dropped the class. He's just like, I caught you. Yeah, Dr. Bush, I study all that. Yeah, uh-huh. Okay, show me. And they don't like to write it down. When you
No.
say,
No.
and I need you to handwrite all this stuff and draw the graph and plot the data. And so Dennis, I call them and they move, they shuffle their feet and they gone. So
Yeah, and
been
that's
there, done that last 30 years, folks. Don't be
yeah.
trying none of this stuff on the old professor. But I'm just going to
No.
wait in the expo. And Dennis caught me last year. Some people come up and start flapping, and I just kind of, okay, let me give them the next level question. Okay, I think we got to about the third level, and then it kind of like smoke just kind of just whispered away, at that, and that's fine. Most people can't even make it to the first level question. So it was nice to get to a couple level questions. But Dennis,
And and here's the scary thing. There are a lot of smart people at that fantasy football expo,
oh yeah,
but there are quite a few who are not very dynamic thinkers. They're good at making noise about things that are going on in the industry, but I don't think they're very dynamic in how they look at the data. And folks, there's nothing wrong with that.
oh, that's
Like,
fine. You can have fun.
everybody has their area of expertise, but it's about the only industry I've ever seen where people will self-proclaim to be an expert and they won't be completely knowledgeable in all the areas that they really need to be in order to be a real expert. Like
Yeah.
it's really weird because yes, I've been very profitable in fantasy football over the years. The ROI has been very good. And it's not luck because I'm not the world's luckiest person in every regard in my life.
Yeah.
But I'm also not an expert at all things fantasy football. I have my strengths and weaknesses like any forecaster, just like in weather forecasting. I wasn't the greatest expert on forecasting the weather for every place in the country. I was really good at some specific places. That's the difference in fantasy football is you got to know your strengths and weaknesses. And I don't think a lot of people will even admit that they have a weakness.
That's
And
why
that
your
is,
diary, Dennis, with your
yes.
recipes helps you find that.
And when you and I encounter a problem, quite often the answer will be, I don't know. That is a legitimate answer. But we don't just throw our arms up and say, well, we don't know.
Or, Dr. Bush, I got all them notes. Okay, let me see your 200
We
pages.
we
Ruh-roh.
do the research. Like and that's it. Like for instance, I was talking about the 310 number
Yeah, it's
in my
interesting.
study. Okay.
Yeah,
So we had 6 over 310 last year,
yeah.
2023, 3 of them
Mm-hmm.
were over. Incidentally, of the 3 that were over in 2023,
Yeah,
Christian McCaffrey, we know what happened.
yeah.
Rashad White,
Ruh-roh.
we know what happened. Trevor Etienne Jr.,
Ruh-roh.
we know what happened. And the weirdest thing, at 309,
Yeah.
there's nothing statistically different
No,
between
no, there's not.
309 and 310.
Yeah,
Okay. But at 309, it was Joe Mixon.
yeah.
Huge increase in MVP. At 308, Derrick Henry. Huge increase in MVP. And then there was Tony Pollard at 307, and he kind of had an average season. He didn't really do much in the way he did go up a little on MVP. But yes, last year was different. That's 6 versus 3.
Yeah.
We had 6 in 2022.
Yeah.
We had only 3 in 2021. Weird pattern setting up.
And like I said, folks, what I did and stepped in when Dennis said that, I gave him at least 2 suggestions
Oh yeah,
for deeper analysis.
and I wrote them both down, and
I knew you
both,
did.
they will both
And
be researched
yeah,
eventually.
so eventually, yeah. And that's part of not only your diary, but if you can find somebody that helps balance you out on things that are not, you don't have time to do or you're not as good at, that's all I can say. I think that as long as you guys don't compete, and no offense, Dennis and I try to stay out of each other's way. Why should I waste my effort trying to beat somebody that may be as good as me? And it's like, I'm not here to, well, I'm proud, I'm for pride. Folks, I'm for the money. So I don't want to sit at the table with Dennis. Okay, I want a lot of dummies at the table so I can have the easy chips, easy money. Why
and
am I
I
having to
will.
work at it? I'm too old to have to beat Dennis. Let
It,
Dennis go whip some other folks.
yeah, in Dynasty, I will take on some sharks,
Yeah,
but
but Dennis,
I also
you
take a
had
lot.
Dennis. Look, you get into the bit a lot more than me. You
Yeah,
know, you hadn't been wore out by 30 years of students pulling
but
shenanigans. See, you still got, all that optimism, Dennis. You're such an optimistic guy, and I've been ground down by the
but
system. I'm
but
old and tired now.
but Professor, if I'm playing in 25 Dynasty leagues,
Yeah. You better
I'm not
have some that you can win at.
I'm not playing against the Sharks in 25
I was
leagues.
about to say, I wouldn't
I
play
might
it.
play 3 or 4 against the Sharks
Yeah.
and win one of those,
Hmm.
and then play 20 against the tuna
Yeah.
and feast on the tuna.
Yeah.
Now it's I'm not going head to head
Yeah.
against the professor in a redraft league if
Right.
I could avoid it. Now we did go head to head in a couple of best balls because we wanted to draft against each other to show
Yeah.
subject matter for the show.
Yeah. But
But
they're
we're
$5,
doing that at $5, folks. We're not doing that at higher
35. Yeah.
money.
50,
That's for
100.
sure.
Yeah.
But the whole point of what I wanted to bring up today
Yeah.
is the value of studies, because
And I'm going to show you some
I
data,
went
Dennis.
I went into the one study thinking 120 was the magic number on MVP.
Yeah. No, it's
Came
100.
away came away the 100 is probably
Right
the number.
now, I'm believing 100, but
I'm going to
like I
compare to
said,
100.
yeah.
I'm going to compare to 100,
But
and the way I'm
again,
going
your
to
100 is there. If it's with running backs, you need to think about the reception ratio.
yes,
Just double
yes,
check all that and
will
see if there's
do.
some light
Yes,
at that tunnel there.
absolutely. And when it came to touches,
Yeah,
I was thinking 350 was
yeah,
the number that I thought was going to define the position. And I looked at that. I'm like, you know what? We have like 3 guys over
no,
350
yeah,
every year. Is it
310
really going
sound
to
like
be anything?
yeah,
310 astonished me.
yeah,
That's not a lot,
no.
because
If you have a combination of, with the running backs catching more, I think a lot of passes these years.
yes. But if you look at that and you say, okay, out of 17 games, he's going to take
Yeah,
one game off.
yeah,
That's 19 touches a game.
yeah,
That's not a lot.
yeah,
That's not huge.
yeah,
And that is the volume that is showing a decrease. And
yeah.
when you have 17 of something, and all 17 come up on the decrease side,
Mm-hmm.
that's scary. That's a pretty good number. And, granted, the farther I get away from 310, the higher it goes, the more I'm going to get concerned. But here's the thing. If the MVP was 150 last year and my data says maybe a 10% decline, maybe even a 20% decline. Well, if Bijan Robinson drops 20% in value, he's still a 127, Professor. That is traditionally reserved for top 3.
Right.
I'm okay with drafting him first and having him finish 3rd.
Gotcha.
I'm okay with that. What I'm not okay is if I've got a Kyron Williams at 119. Okay, so that's top 4, top 5-ish. And all of a sudden he declines 20%. We're talking that takes him down to top 15.
Yeah. That
I'm all of a sudden, I'm not so happy with that. So that's how I'm going to use the data this year, is just as an additional check and balance. I'm not going to, okay, he had over 310, I'm not drafting him. No, that would be a stupid application of data.
Yeah.
I don't want to apply data in a stupid way, but whenever you do a study, three things are going to happen. One, you find out if there's any validity to your hypothesis at all.
Right.
Number two is you can find out that there's more study that you need to do.
Right.
And the number three is there's absolutely no, if I had 17 players there, or let's say 25 players that were over 310,
Right.
and 12 of them increased and 12 of them decreased and one stayed the same, then I don't even have any useful data. So that's the third possibility of any test. Any study you do, you can either find out your hypothesis isn't even close. If I know that my hypothesis was wrong, I can improve my hypothesis. I can improve my knowledge.
Well, you go and ask another question.
You ask another question. But if the data is 50% either side, it probably is telling me.
Well, usually what happens in stats is you get a number and you reject your hypothesis. You don't.
Correct.
You really falsify and then
Yes.
you move on. That's kind of and that's why we have to have stats. If you don't have stats, then you're left wondering, and that's fine. Look, in the exploration phase, you don't have to do stats on everything because you never get any work done. So you've got to tailor what you're doing with some hierarchical rules of thumb. And then once you clarify, right, like 310, is it really 312? I mean, 310, okay, I think we got an idea. And at some point, if you've got enough years and enough time, you do the final stats and you get a clear answer. But we're just exploring right now.
And here's the thing. Even though it's 17 for 17, which seems very impressive.
It does.
That's only 17 data points.
Yeah, that's not as strong as you think.
That's not very strong. But here's the thing is I understand that because I understand.
But again, you have the recipe for the understanding, and I'm not sure other people do.
No, they don't. But that's the thing is if it was 100 for 100,
starts getting stronger.
I feel better than at 17 for 17. Although 17 for 17
is suspicious.
It's still interesting. And this study told me two things. First of all, it gave you two more ideas for how to look at this data, which are both perfect and will both be used in the future. Because here's the joy of it. Once we get to the point that we're just drafting, I still got some time to do some extra studies. Maybe they won't help us for this year, but they'll help us in future years. And during the season, I'll have time to do more studies as well. So we never stop studying the data is the key. During the off season, you have the luxury of having a few more minutes to study because you have less drafting to do and less team management to do. But was fascinated, did not expect this result. If you had told me, do you think you're going to come up with a clean data with more than 5 data points? I'd say hell no. So 17 is pretty good. It's not enough to convince me, but it's enough to make me look at stuff and say, okay, if I'm drafting a Saquon Barkley at 378, maybe I look a different direction than just blindly taking Saquon as the first pick in the draft. Because if I'd applied that last year with Christian McCaffrey, I would have looked like an idiot taking anybody but McCaffrey, but I would have been smarter because I would have ended up in this seat this year. If I get off of my top running back, it's because I'm going top wide receiver. And I'm going Jamar Chase because I've got those guys with an MVP that's pretty close. It's their range of outcomes are both the same. Their range of outcomes says this guy is probably going to be top 5 in his worst case. Like there aren't many guys that you have that where I guess technically though, I've got them both down for because again, I'm very generous in my forecast. I'm very, open minded to having a wide range because it is May 17th again. But right now, their range for both of those players is 1 to 9. So even if I'm wrong on their forecast, the worst I'm going to be is getting the 9th best player. I'm not going to be that unhappy about that versus a guy who might have 1 to 15 as his range right now. So right now, those are my 2 top players, Bijan Robinson and Gibbs at running back, Chase at wide receiver. I'm feeling pretty good about those 3 players if I'm in that first 3 picks in the draft.
Gotcha. Just wanted to quickly hit you with this, Dennis. This is the data that I'm working on. Our Bush number, our MVP, and all this other data. Just showing people an example. Excel allows you to colorize squares based on certain numeric values. That's the top 20% in green of the population. So if you sort fantasy points per game, the result is looking at the Bush number, LR, the slice, and the MVP. You could start imagining patterns. And if people are curious, this is how I start. And notice I got touchdowns, rushing, completions, all sorts of other data I hadn't even looked into yet. Games played. I just wanted to show this to Dennis. Looks like these ones that are the top 3 in the top 20%, the only 3, looks like there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of those quarterbacks. This was in 2023. And 6 of those, they were all in the top 20% fantasy points per game. So that's encouraging when you see something like that. And I'm going to do a lot more study. I just wanted to kind of tease Dennis a little bit with some of the data. So, when we start trying to develop a recipe, how much is MVP worth versus the Bush figure versus some other metrics we'll have? How much is that worth on, say, passing yards or fantasy points? But we can ask that question, Dennis. That's coming. And I'll combine 2020, 2021, 22, 23, and 24. So I just did the 1 year here. And I'm just going to throw that out. And, if people are curious about other things, you can see the good thing with Excel is you can sort, data sort by, let's say, Bush slice, large to small, and we'll see. Not bad. Only, the top 20% of Bush. Not bad. This only
No.
2, yeah, that kind of thing.
And look at where the outliers were. They were close.
Yeah. So it's just, again, that's 1 year, but that's the kind of information I'm trying to gather here, folks.
Yeah.
And just show y'all a little bit of some stuff I'm doing that may or, I probably should, if I was paid money, I would probably throw a lot of this out for public use, but I'm just letting you folks know that there's secret stuff going on that Dennis and I, hey, we're not paid to do it. We want to make money, and the only way it's like trainers, right? We're not going to tell you how our maiden first time starters doing at our barn or our training track that nobody else can see, or we work at 3 o'clock in the morning, nobody else is around. I mean, there's some tricky stuff goes on at horse racing as well, Dennis. And, you know, what was it in Kentucky? They say the the first race, the trainer gets. In other words, we don't. In Kentucky, we don't worry too much about all the workouts and everything. We figure the trainer gets to do his tricks the first time. So you just never know about all that. So people try, and that's why they track trainer stats, first time starters, and there is some data, but there are some obscure situations that the stats are not out there or they're hidden or that kind of thing. I mean, it's hard to trick the clockers, Dennis, but there's ways to do it and whatnot. So anyway, Dennis, I just thought I'd show you some stuff I'll be working on for the quarterbacks and the MVP, and then I'll do the other positions, and I'll combine those 5 years, and I'm going to try to at least have an initial recipe here. And again, we'll see what's what, where's where on that. So,
and last year, to let everybody know, we were not sure which one of our metrics would be better,
or a combination of,
or combination. So we did a very simple beta test where we looked at all six and we said early in the draft,
yep,
we want no red flags. We want all green flags. So we want guys that are in that top 25%.
Yeah. So notice the red flags in this would have been Sam Howell 75 and Kyler Murray at 75.
Correct.
So, and one could even argue that those are the ones we don't want. We only want the ones that tend to skew to being in the top group. And this was 2023.
Yeah, and you see that Sam Howell didn't end up being in that elite group when it came to fantasy points per game.
Nope.
And that's how we use this. We did not say, okay, we're going to use 30% of this, 20% of this.
Well, we don't know those numbers. We don't know the recipes.
And we weren't going to make it up. So all we did
but you could by trial and error.
Yes. Yeah.
But that's a lot of work.
But what we did instead was we used logic and we said,
yep,
early in the draft, all the advantages that we can get.
Yes.
Late in the draft, I'll take a chance on a guy who's got a high MVP or a high Bush or a high this versus what the consensus is saying about this player. We even had a few guys that we drafted late because the Vegas props liked them.
Yep. And that was suspicious.
It was suspicious. And it ended up working. What you need to do is to apply logic and then to grade your result. And last year, what we were able to do once ADP was really honed in.
Yep.
And we even knew when it wasn't for a particular player.
Yep.
Because when it comes to ADP, folks, the professor does more study
for patterns.
For patterns, because the patterns can give you a big payoff. Yeah. Because if I am sitting there and I'm in the tight end market and I missed on the first two, and I say, okay, I want one of the top 4 tight ends.
Yep.
When do I have to make this move?
Round 4 in best ball.
I have the data.
Right now.
I have the data because the professor has provided us the data and says, and if I want a quarterback, I want a top 3 quarterback. When do I have to
round 3?
I have to move round 3.
And so this allows you to plan, Dennis. So I've done this for us. I just wanted to bring this up, folks, because right now, probably in June, I'll start getting more serious. But I did want if people followed me and Dennis, we've done this patterns
Oh
and
yeah.
we've discussed it all the time, every couple of weeks. Dennis, here's the new ADPs, and there's some more data I can do. And this first 4 rounds, and I like to mark where the RB1s and the WR1s are ending, and they're both in round 3. So if you're wanting a couple running backs or a couple wide receivers in the top 12, you've got to make your choices pretty much first two. You could do wide receiver, or running back, or mix them. But you're not going to be able, probably in round 3, unless you're really fortuitous, you're not going to be able to grab WR and an RB in the top 12. You're going to miss somewhere if that is what you're thinking. And remember, we're using MVP and all these other metrics, and we're not. This doesn't mean we're stuck at anything. Maybe we like a running back in round 4, and so that gives us opportunity to grab, WR, and then our first one down here. I mean, we could. I don't know if we would, but we could. And then in round 3,
yeah.
pick that tight end or pick that QB if we wanted.
So here's where the better than zero strategy comes into play. So the theory of better than zero for folks
And you got
new,
articles, you go
I've
into
got
all that.
articles.
Y'all can
You can
check it
head
out.
over there and check it out. But the idea is you reverse engineer your team. Okay. So I look and I say, I want an elite tight end. I want an elite quarterback. So I'm like that fat kid in Caddyshack. I want a cheeseburger. I want I want this. I want that. You get nothing and you'll be happy. But I want an elite quarterback. I want an elite tight end. That's where I think I'm going to get an edge. My definition of elite tight end and elite quarterback are very different.
Yes.
I want a quarterback in the top 6, and I'm happy. So this data says, okay, you can
You
roll
could
the
take
dice and wait till the
Mahomes
5th.
in the 5th round.
Yeah. If I
And
want,
so you can look,
yeah,
Dennis, and let's see. Let's see, the 5th round, the quarterback. Here it is, 61. So there is a big gap between the number 4, Dennis, right here.
yeah,
Burrow at 40. There's 20 slots.
yeah.
And if you think Mahomes gives you enough to keep your team in the hunt, then you get an advantage because you can go cherry pick elsewhere. You need to make those decisions. It's
Yes.
your Dennis is, you're not, oh, this is what I've got to do. This is what you could do. And, here it is. So this allows you to predict patterns, and you're running, you're better than zero. Looks like Mahomes would be or you could really gamble and go Baker Mayfield, and he's the 7th quarterback, Dennis.
Yeah, and I'd be
Maybe
happy
that's
with
your
them.
choice. Maybe
I'm
that's the coin, or maybe take both of them.
in this year again, I'm more willing to play chicken at quarterback than I am at tight end. At tight end,
Well, look at
I've
look
got,
at how they're setting up this
yeah.
year.
So I've
One,
got,
two, you got one per round they're giving
yes.
you.
So I've got 2 tight ends that I've got defined as the elite guys.
Bowers at 5th, though, Dennis, is that,
Bowers. So what this tells me
and McBride at
is
14.
this is dependent on where I draft this year.
Definitely.
If I'm a top 6 or 7 pick in the draft,
You're probably not going to,
I got a shot at Bowers if I'm
but
top
I
7.
doubt,
But he's going pretty
we've never
tight.
had a tight end that I know go this
No.
early.
And I'm willing to pass on Bowers
Just
because,
folks, I'm talking Kelsey 10 or
oh
11
yeah,
back in the
yeah,
day was
yes.
I've never seen anything like this for
Yeah, and
Bowers.
and this is a complete change of offense, complete change of everything out there
And so
in
he's
Las
worth the fifth.
Vegas. He's Is he worth the fifth? I'm not sure I'm taking him at five because I think there are guys on the list, including
Yeah,
St. Brown and
yeah,
Neighbors, that I like a whole lot better than a second year tight end
yeah.
at the fifth pick in the draft. So I'm probably fading. I probably won't have much in the way of Bowers. But here comes, I want Trey McBride,
Yeah.
but I'm still not going to take him in the first round. So I've got to
Kittle,
be a late,
Laporta.
I got to be a late pick in that first round in order to get him early enough in the second. If I miss on those two, I'm not really pushing the Kittle one. Kittle's too expensive, in my opinion. That was a perfect storm last year for Kittle, with
Yes, it
both
was.
McCaffrey, Ayuk, and Samuel being down. That was the perfect storm. Yes, I still have Kittle ranked as my number 3 tight end, but I have his MVP dropping all the way to 75.
Ooh.
So I've got 25-point difference between my top tight end and my third tight end. That next 25 points takes you all the way down to tight end 12.
Yeah.
So 3 is not that big of an advantage over 7 or 8. Now, Kelsey is an interesting one. He's
So
coming at a
11
point.
tight ends are gone by
Yeah.
round 8.
Yeah.
So everybody's taking their tight end by round 8, folks.
And there's
So
a
there's the decision. And it
yes.
looks like, looky here, Dennis, 6, 7, and 8, people are starting to turn to grab that tight end. So there's a lot here, but people are waiting. So if you like the tight end in the 5th round, so if you love Hawkinson, then you can wait till the 5th round. But it looks like if you can pass on him, you're going to have a choice of Jonnu, Kelsey, uh, let's see who else, Ingram, Andrews, Njoku. So
Yeah.
there's your pick. Do you want to take Laporta or wait and even go further? But at this point, Njoku's about the last guy off the train, Dennis. You better have your decision made of your strategy by round 8. You better have made something. Either I'm going to really punt and do a 3 tight end stream, with some of these situational tight ends, or you've taken one of these guys.
So I've got a long shot that I really like at tight end this
Yeah,
year.
yeah. Well,
So obviously I like Zach Ertz again,
yeah,
but Ertz is getting up in age.
yes,
So he's a little riskier. So Evan Ingram
yeah,
has been a pretty good performer over the last few years, right?
yeah,
How about Brenton Strange? He's
yep,
taking over that same role with Jacksonville.
yes.
Look how far down
Oh,
I can go and get
he's
him.
yeah, he's deep.
So if I miss on the first 2,
Mm-hmm.
I then got a few in that 5th to 7th range that I'll look at, or 4th to 8th range that I'll look at.
Yeah.
But if I don't land one of those,
Okay.
I'm waiting. And I'm waiting.
Sounds like your strategy is if they come to me, if the Njoku drops down to say near 100 or 95, I'll take him. But if not, I'm not worried because I'll take Strange.
I'll take Strange. I'll take Ertz. I'll take Strange and Ertz. I'll take Ertz, Loveland, Strange, a combination thereof.
But see, you got a strategy based on these patterns.
Correct.
Based and if I take, on better than 0.
If I take Ertz, I'm probably also taking Strange. Or if I take If I don't land a top guy, I'm probably taking two. Is kind of the strategy. But again, that's the game plan.
Mhm.
You can call an audible. You can go to the Omaha call.
Right.
But I like going into a draft. My first goal at tight end is going to be McBride.
Yeah.
It's not going to be Bowers. Bowers is too early.
So if you're on the turn, you could do
I'm probably going
a wide
top.
receiver
Yep.
and a tight end.
Wide receiver and tight end, and I'll
And you
be
have an
happy with that.
opportunity
What I would love
to
is to be what I'd be love to be doing is drafting about 10th and have St. Brown fall to me.
Yeah. Take St. Brown.
So
and then
because I got
take
St.
the
Brown listed as my number 2
Yeah.
wide receiver.
Right. And
Okay.
he's
Neighbors
going, Dennis, he's going 11th.
he's going 11th. So if I get him at 10, or I
You
can get
could take
or if I can get
McBride.
Malik Neighbors at fall to 10,
Right.
which is only one spot,
You could double up and take McBride.
then I can come back with McBride. Now I'm set at tight end. Now I'm set it, forget it. And because I got an elite tight end, now I'm a little more flexible at quarterback, but my top quarterback is Joe Burrow.
Yeah.
He's going number 5.
Yeah. So you got round 4. So you got a little flexibility round
So I can get
3.
So I can get a wide receiver, tight end, elite, a pretty good running back. Pretty good running back.
Now remember, my ADP data from I showed last week that people, looking at the video, running backs going to the top 18 in ADP preseason, finishing, it's not as bad as you think.
No,
in other words,
no.
picking one in the 3rd round, Dennis, is not, you're not surrendering by any means. So we're talking maybe Chase Brown,
I'd take
Amar,
that.
Hampton,
I'd
Cook,
be happy with that. Yep.
Walker,
Yep.
Mixon,
I'm okay
Kamara,
with any of those. Any of those
Trayvon
guys.
Henderson.
Yep.
So your strategy then is deciding kind of your order of those guys.
Yeah, and here's the thing is my better than zero drafts more shots at the running back position than anywhere
Later.
else. And I've been pretty successful
Yes.
at diagnosing running back possibilities.
Yes.
So if I end up grabbing 9 running backs,
right,
I'm going to be right often enough of those 9 shots. Let's say 9 shots,
right,
and one is close to a sure bet because I'm taking him early enough that I'm getting a top 18 guy.
right.
So my other 8 shots, if I only hit 1 out of 4, that gives me 2 more. So that gives me 3 reliable running backs and a bunch of patch and fill guys. Yeah, I like my chances in that scenario because I already have one of my top wide receivers, one of my top tight ends. If I could end up after round 5 in a draft, and I've got Burrow at quarterback, McBride at tight end, St. Brown or Neighbors at wide receiver, one of those running backs that we talked about, I'm off to a really strong start. And that's only 4 of the 5 guys that I have. So I'll have 1 more running back and 1 more wide receiver. I like my chances in that scenario of having a successful team because I'll have my number 1 quarterback, my number 2 wide receiver, and my number 2 tight end to go with whatever I get at running back and wide receiver. And it could be 2 running backs back to back, or it could be 2 more wide receivers. I don't know. how it'll end up going. But right now, I have only 3 running backs and 3 wide receivers that I consider first round safe. So, but I'm probably going to get one of those,
Nice.
because there's a lot of the consensus that is higher on a few guys than I am.
Before we go, I know we've been talking a long time, Dennis. We just folks, can you tell we're enthusiastic? I'm so excited this time of year and our exploration. Anyway, I propose to Dennis that these potential players in yellow seem to be higher in variation.
Oh, yeah.
The FFPC looks at the minimum and the max. You just subtract, and then you look around and you see that Lamb and Giante are a little higher than some of these other guys, and then McCaffrey 16, 17, 18, Taylor, Irving, that kind of thing. So I'm inviting Dennis to write his focused articles June, July. We'll track on that, but I think the public is opening its hand and showing us some whole cards here, and I bet there's going to be a lot of discussions on Twitter and whatnot about some of these players because the public has already said they're a little funky on the ceiling and floor on some of these folks, and for good reason. I think CMC's going to bring a lot of discussion. So I could see CD Lamb. I mean, I think they're concerned about Dak and the draft. I mean, but I don't know. You just need to make a decision about. In other words, seeing this mean that Lamb may drop a little bit, right? They may
Yes.
take
Yeah.
Neighbors over Lamb, right? Because in other words, this could be that really fine tiebreaker here. If I love Lamb and Neighbors the same, the public would rather have Neighbors, Dennis, than Lamb. They would point you and say, he's a little bit more uncertain than this one. I'm not saying I buy that. I'm just saying the public's telling you, and it wouldn't surprise me that Neighbors gets shifted up between now and August, and Lamb maybe flips down a little bit, you know?
Yeah. And if I was drafting at 9,
Mm-hmm.
okay, and I see this data and I see that, hey, if I like Neighbors and St. Brown, for instance, and I'm drafting it at slot 9, I
You probably,
might
yeah,
I might take Neighbors figuring, you know what?
yeah,
St. Brown has fallen as low as 17.
yeah,
Guess what happens at that 17th pick? I already have a second shot at him.
yeah, yeah,
And I do that a lot in drafts where
yeah.
I'm looking at a position, and because I'm never looking at one guy.
All right.
Okay. So I'm always looking at, you know, grouping of players. And at wide receiver this year,
Mm-hmm.
after Chase, I'm then looking at
Chase is one. He's going to be the
Chase.
CMC.
Chase is,
Everybody's going to squawk. And
yeah.
I'm telling you, everybody is going to squawk about that. And it's going to be hard to see Chase going further than 3.
Oh no,
Uh,
but
yeah.
here's the thing.
Is he worth a 1, 2, or 3? That's the question you need to ask yourself this year.
So
Public
on,
says yes.
it definitely says
They are
yes,
so look at the number 2.
but here's the thing. So 2 problems with Chase, and you should be able to look at every
But you
player.
said 2 problem, but the public's saying there's no. I
There's no
think they're
problem.
saying no problem.
But when I look at it,
Mm-hmm.
if I'm put up to the decision of taking Chase, who's my top wide receiver, or
Bijan or Barkley.
Bijan or Gibbs, who are my
Oh,
top
okay.
running backs,
Okay.
I'm probably going Bijan or Gibbs over Chase, and I'll tell you why.
Okay.
So Chase is his forecast scheme, okay, low of 85, high of 150 in
Wow.
MVP.
That's broad.
Why is he that low?
Public doesn't see it that way, Dennis.
The risk of a Joe Burrow injury. He
Dennis,
was
I think people are not factoring that in their recipe. They are not including that enough. So that I think that's the kind of thing that gives us an advantage.
yes, and Joe Burrow's got a history of missing time.
Yep.
Okay.
So
Am I
then your MVP top 10 games, in other words, if Chase is ineffectual for say how many weeks Burrow out does he, if you knew that now, would he move down for you?
if he
You see what
missed,
I'm saying?
yes. And
Let's
here's the
say
thing.
Burrow missed 5 games. He got
Yes.
injured. Where would Chase, where should we have drafted if we had a time machine and knew that?
So here is how that range works into that decision.
Okay.
So I've got him a low of 85,
Right.
and that's if Chase misses time.
Yeah.
I don't say how many games, but that's like 3 or 4. He misses 3 or 4 key games for me.
Yeah. Yeah.
I get a little worried. I've got his high side of 150, so that's insane.
Yeah.
I've got his forecast at 135.
Yeah.
You notice it's not in the middle because
No,
if Burrow
it's
if Burrow
skewed.
doesn't yes, if
Yeah.
Burrow doesn't get hurt and Chase doesn't get hurt, his downside is like 120. Okay, his floor without injuries, minor injuries to him or to Burrow or to Higgins. Because here's the thing, Chase is better when Higgins is also on the field. Okay, because if Chase is the only option at wide receiver that they have to shut down, they're going to shut him down.
Yep.
But if Higgins is there, they can't leave Higgins alone. So now it
Yep.
changes. But this all goes into the recipe of forecasting.
The art of
he's
forecasting.
He's got a huge range of possible outcomes, but he's still my number one guy at wide receiver. But because he's got a wider range of outcomes than my top 2
Look at Jefferson,
running backs.
2 and 10.
Yes.
Versus 1
yes.
and 3. Big difference.
Yes. Yes. And that's basically, I think it's justified based on, is JJ McCarthy great? Is he going to be a great quarterback? Is JJ McCarthy even as good as Sam Darnold? Because we saw Sam Darnold and Kirk Cousins really didn't do much to Justin Jefferson. And Jefferson played with some really lousy quarterbacks.
Yes, he did.
After Cousins went down and did just fine. But yeah, that's why he's there. But the other reason he's there is Minnesota didn't throw the ball as much last year.
Nope.
Will they throw the ball even less with a veritable rookie at quarterback? That's why Justin Jefferson is a little riskier than CeeDee Lamb. We know CeeDee Lamb's going to get fed. We know CeeDee Lamb.
But the public would argue the other way.
Yeah, I don't.
So see, this allows us to stack our opinion versus the public, folks. You don't have to wait till August. I can envision these are the folks, the dealer's tipping his hand for you.
Yes.
You need to, if you're drafted this week, I wouldn't, a $5 best ball. Okay, go for it. But I'm saying, I know there's a lot of high money people betting thousands of dollars. Not my money, but I know, boy, would you hate? Think about it. You don't even, camp's not even going. I can just imagine all sorts of crazy stuff happening.
Yes.
And there's my money gone.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Chase gets injured.
Oh, yeah.
Gets in a car wreck coming to the game. We had, we saw that last year with Tyreek Hill, got stopped and pulled over.
Yes.
Craziness. And, it's just, you just never know, folks. And if I'm wishing $1,000, man, I just can't do it. What kind of bankroll would I have to have Folks, do you understand bankroll management? That ain't my total bankroll. You know, that's crazy.
No,
Anyway,
no, and that's important too, and that's another discussion we had. If you've got $1,000 to play on fantasy football,
don't play in one league,
break it
please.
up into at least 10 leagues.
Please
At least 10 leagues. I mean, I try to
give yourself a
spread.
chance to win
Correct.
money.
Correct. I try to play across I do have different levels of dynasty,
Right.
starting at 10, going all the way up to 100 a year.
Yeah.
But I try to not have a skew of too many $100 leagues or too many $10 leagues. I try to have my average cost be about $50.
Right.
And that way I've got, some higher, some lower. It all evens itself out. And in
Yeah.
redraft, you can manage that a lot better than you can. But Professor, great job inspiring 2 new studies last week and 2 more new studies this week, but also 2 more articles, because I will get the Opportunity Index article out now that I've got the research done. And I will have the art of the forecast to explain my theory behind how I do it. Your theory, folks, does not need to be the same.
Nope.
But you need to have a strategy
and keep it in a diary so you know it's viable.
And that way, how your results were, where your weaknesses, where your strengths are, and you can improve over time. So head on over to the scienceoffantasyfootball.com. Check out the videos that the professor did
on the ADP.
Each position. Well, the ADP is one thing, but your reference class forecasting videos, you need to check all of those out for each position.
There's 4 of them.
They were fascinating stuff. I'll have a couple more articles for you this week as well, and come back here next week for another edition of the Science of Fantasy Football.
Get to work, folks. Woo woo.
I'm telling you, Professor.
We get fired up, don't we?
We do get fired
up. People don't realize, woo woo, this gets you through.
But it is it's therapy too.
Yeah,
but
it is therapy.
It's very good.
We need podcast therapy.
But no, what is great about this, and this is for everybody out there who wants to get better at the game.
This is after the show.
This is after the show conversation.
Yeah.
Find yourself someone who is as close to equally smart on the subject as you are.
Yep.
Because the two of you, it's not 1 + 1 = 2.
Nope.
Because you get a synergy between two good people at something, and that leads to 1 + 1 becomes 5. And then you work with each other over a number of years, and you just the change is logarithmic. It is not a linear change in your abilities, and it really does show up. But the podcast, more than anything else, Professor, it teaches me to think smarter.
Yep.
Because of the way you break down the data. And I love seeing that every week.
Yep. It's good. I enjoyed it. It's fun. I think there's a lot of stuff happening. I'm going to try to, probably have some more ADP stuff in June after I get back. We're going to Alaska in a couple of weeks, Dennis.
That's going to be exciting.
Yeah, going to have some fun. I got my book of Alaskan birds, so I love ornithology, so I'm going to be trying to spot those rare birds here, kind of like finding that deep sleeper here. But I don't think there's a fantasy receipts for bird watching, so they won't be able to laugh at me when I call a bird one thing and it really is another. I don't want to get publicly shamed in my ornithology skills. On ornithology Twitter, I try to fly low, Dennis, so they don't laugh at my poor skills of bird analysis. I'm kind of like the Wally Cox of of bird watchers. If you've never seen Beverly Hillbillies, you don't know he played a recurring character. He had the Boy Scout uniform and he was out
Oh
watching.
yes, that
Don't you
that was
remember? And
that was
Granny
Wally
would just look at
Cox.
him and just
Oh, that's funny.
Jethro would
I
come
com-
out with him and they just look
com-
at this guy, Wally
complete
Cox.
completely forgot
Oh
about
man,
him on
that
that
was he was a
show
great of that show. You know, the
because
bird watcher. Everybody's, Miss Hathaway joined him and they would
yes,
both go bird watching and the Clampetts just looking around like, what the hell?
when I think of Wally Cox, I think of Hollywood Squares. He
Yeah.
was hilarious on that show.
And I'm sure he had some other shows, but I remember his work on being the bird watcher on the Beverly Hillbillies. So everybody should be
Hillbillies.
that. So I do not have a little Boy Scout uniform for Alaska. Okay, but I do have some binoculars, and I will be admiring the whales and all the other sea mammals there. That's the only time my wife lets me pick up the binoculars, not spying on the neighbors at the pool here, the young ladies at the pool here, get myself in trouble, get my head slapped. And so I watched the bird in my Merlin app, Dennis. I've been having a great time, hearing the
Yes,
birds and starting to learn the bird calls. So
that is a
I
fun
am a
time.
bird watching Wally Cox nerd, big time.
Well, well, you'll love this since you love bird watching.
Yeah.
So, um, the DMike Media logo. I don't know if I ever showed you.
Yes, it's
My
the little Twitter thing, little
it's a
Twitty
little,
bird thing, but
but
it's blue.
that bird
Mm-hmm.
actually existed in real life.
Oh wow!
So yes, so the first date that I ever went on with Stacy,
Oh wow!
we were hiking at this park, and this particular bird seemed to be following us. So I
Oh
took a picture of this bird
yeah.
when we were out about walking. So when I had the logo for D Mike Media made up, I sent that bird to the guy at Fiverr who did the logo for me. And that is how that bird ended up on the D Mike Media logo.
Yep. That's
So
great.
we love birds.
Yeah, yeah, it's
Love
good. Get your
and,
kids
and try to
out.
keep the dog from eating the birds
Yeah,
is
that's
always our goal.
okay. We're getting off topic here. Let me shut down the recording.